My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 44 years old, and the day my own son looked me in the eye and said, "We want the inheritance," something inside me cracked in a way I didn't know was still possible. Not asked, not suggested, demanded. And standing right beside him was his father, the man I gave half my life to, the man who once promised to protect me. Before I go any further, listen to me carefully. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that you forgot to protect yourself, if you've ever been taken for granted by the people you sacrificed everything for, I need you to stay with me. Like this story.
Subscribe.
And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this isn't just my story. It's a warning. They didn't come at me with anger. That would have been easier to survive. They came at me calm, calculated, polite. We were sitting at the dining table I picked out 20 years ago. The same table I hosted birthdays on, holidays, homework nights, heart-to-hearts. The same table I wiped down with my own hands after everyone left, every single time. My son didn't look at me when he spoke. He said, "Mom, we've talked this through. It just makes sense." That's when his father leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said it plainly. "We want the estate, the accounts, the business, everything. Everything." As if I was already gone. As if my life had been reduced to paperwork they were ready to file away. I remember blinking. Once. Twice. Trying to understand what language we were even speaking anymore. Because this wasn't my son. This wasn't the boy whose scraped knees I kissed. This wasn't the child who cried when I stayed late at work. And the man beside him, God, I barely recognized him either. The man I built a life with. The man who once held my hand in the hospital when my mother died. Now sitting there like a stranger doing a business negotiation. They had already decided. They weren't asking for permission. They were informing me. And the worst part? They expected me to agree. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought they could hear it. My ears rang. My mouth went dry. And yet, I stayed calm. Too calm. Because somewhere deep inside me, something ancient and exhausted whispered, "Here it is. This is the moment you've been preparing for without knowing it." I looked at my son, my baby, my only child. "Do you really feel that way?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second. Then his father spoke for him. "We've talked it through. It's the logical thing. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." I almost laughed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the nights I slept on the floor of our child's room when he had fevers. If he remembered the promotions I turned down so I could be home. The opportunities one let go of so he could chase his dreams. But instead I nodded. And that confused them. Because they were expecting tears. Yelling, bargaining. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had already buried my shock years earlier. You see, this wasn't the first betrayal. It was just the loudest. Long before that day, before the paperwork, before the entitlement, I had felt something shifting. Subtle at first. A tone change. A look exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. Conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. You ever get that feeling? That your presence suddenly makes people uncomfortable in your own home? I did. And I started paying attention. I noticed how my husband stopped asking my opinion on finances. How he'd brush off my questions with, "Don't worry about it." How my son began parroting his phrases, his dismissive tone, his impatience. I watched them bond over excluding me, and I stayed quiet. Because when people think you're weak, they reveal everything. They talk too much. They get careless. They show you exactly who they are. And I learned how often money moved without explanation. I learned how decisions were made without me. I learned how quickly respect disappears when someone believes they've already won. And still, I said nothing, because I was tired of being emotional, tired of being too sensitive, tired of being told I was imagining things. So I started listening instead of reacting. And while they were planning how to remove me from the picture, I was preparing for what came next. But I didn't let them see that. That day at the table, I swallowed every instinct screaming inside me. I nodded slowly. I said, "If that's what you both want." And do you know what happened? They relaxed. They smiled. My son exhaled like a burden had been lifted. His father leaned back and said, "Good. This doesn't have to be ugly." Ugly. I wanted to laugh at the irony, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I had already signed something. Something that would decide everything. But not yet. Not yet. I let them talk. They talked about timelines, lawyers, fair divisions, what they thought I deserved, what they were willing to let me keep. They used words like generous. They said I should be grateful. And I nodded. I nodded so well, I almost convinced myself. That night, after they left, I sat alone in the living room. The same living room I decorated. The same couch I paid for. The same walls that had heard my laughter, my crying, my prayers. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there in silence and realized something terrifyingly calm. They thought this was the end. But for me, it was finally the beginning. If you're still here with me, if you're still listening, tell me, have you ever been underestimated by the people who should have known you best? Because what came next was not anger. It was precision. And I was just getting started. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment my son said, "We want the inheritance." We. Not he. We. That word hurt more than anything else. Because it told me this wasn't confusion. This wasn't manipulation alone. This was alignment. He had chosen a side. And it wasn't mine. I kept hearing his voice from when he was little. "Mom, look at me. Mom, watch this. Mom, don't leave yet." And now he couldn't even look at me while stripping me down to assets and numbers. I want you to understand something. Betrayal from a partner wounds you. Betrayal from your own child rewrites your soul. It makes you question every choice you ever made, every sacrifice, every night you stayed up, every dream you postponed. I asked myself, was I too soft, too present, too forgiving, or was I just convenient? Because that's what I realized next. I wasn't loved anymore. I was useful. And once usefulness ends, entitlement replaces affection. The next morning, I made coffee like everything was normal. I folded laundry. I answered emails. I smiled when spoken to. I played the role they expected me to play. The broken woman. The tired woman. The woman who didn't have the strength to fight. And they bought it. You should have seen the way his father spoke to me after that. Slower. Louder. Like I was fragile. Like I was already fading. He'd say things like, "This will be easier for you in the long run," and "You don't want the stress of managing everything at your age." At my age. I wanted to ask him what age he thought wisdom came from. Because it certainly wasn't youth. My son started avoiding me. Short answers. No eye contact. He'd disappear into his room when I entered the house. And when I asked him if he was okay, he said, "Dad says this is hard on everyone. You should stop making it harder." Stop making it harder. Tell me, have you ever been told to be quiet while someone dismantled your life? I started noticing how they spoke about the future. Their future. Without me in it. Trips they planned. Investments they discussed. Decisions already made. I was already erased. And that's when something inside me hardened. Not into bitterness, but clarity. I stopped asking questions. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my worth. And instead, I remembered everything. I remembered the first time I noticed money moving strangely years ago. The first time accounts didn't line up. The first time I was told, "You don't need to worry about that." So I worried. Quietly. I went back through old documents, old emails, old records. I reviewed things I had signed without thinking, things I had trusted him with, things I had once assumed were safe because love was involved. Love doesn't protect you from greed. Preparation does. And over time, without panic, without confrontation, I did something that saved me. I separated. Not emotionally. Legally. I made sure what was mine. I made sure what was tied to risk stayed tied to them. I consulted quietly. Carefully. Not to fight, but to understand. Because knowledge is power, and silence is camouflage. I want you to hear this part clearly. If you're watching this right now and thinking, "I could never do that," I'd confront them immediately. That instinct? That's how people lose everything. Because confrontation alerts the enemy. Patience disarms them. Weeks passed. Then months. Lawyers were mentioned. Meetings scheduled. Papers drafted. And every step of the way, they underestimated me more. My son started speaking to me like I was already gone. Like my opinions no longer mattered. Like my presence was temporary. And that hurt more than I can explain. But I didn't show it. Because pain is loud. And strategy is quiet. The day we sat down with the lawyers, they were confident. Relaxed. Smiling. My son wore the same watch his father had given him, bought with money he didn't understand, from accounts he never questioned. They talked over me. They explained things to me. They acted like I should be grateful they were handling everything. And then came the moment I will never forget. My lawyer looked at me and said, "You don't have to agree to this. We can fight." And my son finally looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw something dangerous in his eyes. Expectation. He expected me to fold. To save him. To clean up one last mess. I looked back at him and said calmly, "No. Let them have it all." You should have seen their faces. Shock. Relief. Greed. They thought they had won. They didn't know they were stepping into something already sealed. I signed where they told me to sign. I handed over the pen. I smiled when they smiled. And inside me, something finally went quiet. Because the decision had already been made. And what they were about to inherit wasn't wealth. It was the weight of every choice they never questioned. If you're still here, if you're still listening, tell me, do you believe betrayal deserves mercy or consequences? Because what happened next is where everything collapsed. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought the signing meant victory. They thought I'd finally accepted my place. Quiet, diminished, grateful for whatever scraps they allowed me to keep. But what they didn't understand was that the moment I picked up that pen, the story had already turned. I remember the room clearly. Too clean. Too cold. The kind of place where emotions don't belong. The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne. Power lived there. Control lived there. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was standing in the center of it. My son sat beside his father, legs crossed, arms folded, wearing that same expression he used to wear when he thought he'd won an argument as a teenager. That quiet smugness. That certainty that he was right and I was wrong. It broke my heart all over again, because I could still see the boy he used to be inside the man he was becoming. But I also saw something else. I saw entitlement. And entitlement is dangerous when it's never challenged. The lawyer slid the papers toward me. Thick. Heavy. Page after page of language designed to confuse, intimidate, overwhelm. My ex-husband didn't even look at them. He didn't need to. He thought he already knew how this would end. "You understand this means you're walking away from everything?" he said, his tone almost kind, almost paternal. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I understand." That's when my son let out a breath I don't think he realized he was holding. Relief. And that hurt more than anger ever could. Because in that moment I knew he believed I was weak. And I let him believe it. I signed where they pointed. Page after page. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. I didn't cry. And every signature felt like laying a brick into place. Because what they didn't know, what they never once bothered to ask, was what exactly they were taking. They saw titles, ownership, control. I saw liabilities, debt, obligations, responsibility. They saw inheritance. I saw consequence. And the moment the final signature dried, I felt something lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Before we conclude," he said carefully, "I need to review the attached disclosures." That's when everything changed. I watched my ex-husband's expression shift, just slightly, as the lawyer's brow furrowed. He flipped a page, then another, then another. Silence stretched. My son leaned forward. "What's taking so long?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Well, there appears to be an issue regarding the liabilities tied to these assets." I watched my ex stiffen. "What do you mean, issue?" he asked. The lawyer cleared his throat again. "The properties listed here, the business accounts, the lines of credit, they're not free and clear." My ex laughed once. A short, sharp sound. "Of course they are. I built that company." The lawyer looked up slowly. "Sir, according to these documents, the combined debt exceeds the total asset value." The room went very, very quiet. My son frowned. "That doesn't make sense." The lawyer turned the pages so they could see. Mortgage balances, loans, deferred payments, interest stacking on interest, numbers climbing like staircases with no landings. I watched the color drain from my ex's face. "That's not right," he whispered. "That can't be right." The lawyer didn't look at me. He didn't need to. These documents are legally binding. They've been active for years. My ex turned toward me slowly. "What did you do?" I met his eyes calmly. "I told you I understood what I was signing." The realization hit him like a wave. The estate they demanded wasn't an inheritance. It was a sinkhole, and they had just jumped in willingly. My son stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "No," he said. No, this isn't, Mom. Say something." I looked at him. Really looked at him. "I did," I said softly. "You just didn't listen." The lawyer continued, his voice steady, professional, merciless. "By accepting full ownership, you also assume full responsibility for outstanding obligations. That includes outstanding loans, deferred tax liabilities, and personal guarantees." My ex's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You said this was clean," he whispered. The lawyer shook his head. "I said you declined further review." Silence swallowed the room. And then came the sound I'll never forget. My son's voice cracking. "You knew," he said to me. "You knew, and you didn't tell us." I looked at him and felt something in my chest finally break, not in pain, but in release. "I tried to tell you," I said quietly. "For years. You just stopped listening." Tears welled in his eyes. Not because of money, because he finally understood what he had done, what he had chosen. My ex stood up abruptly, panic replacing arrogance. "This isn't fair," he said. "You tricked us." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I trusted you. You chose to take advantage of that." The lawyer cleared his throat again. "If there's nothing further, we can conclude." My ex looked at me like I was a stranger, like I had become something dangerous. And maybe I had, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sacrificing myself to keep the peace. I stood up. I picked up my bag, and I looked at my son one last time. "I love you," I said, "but love doesn't mean letting you destroy me." And then I walked out, not angry, not shaking, free. If you're still here with me, if you felt that shift, that moment when you realize your silence has protected everyone except yourself, then you understand what came next. Because the aftermath was brutal. The hallway outside that office felt longer than it had when I walked in. Every step echoed. Every breath felt heavier. Not because I was weak, but because something inside me had finally settled. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear raised voices. My ex arguing with the lawyer. My son saying my name over and over like he could still pull me back into the role I'd played my whole life. But I didn't turn around. Because when you spend decades being the emotional glue that holds everyone together, the moment you stop, everything collapses. And that collapse is not your fault. I walked out into the sunlight and stood there for a moment, just breathing. No one was waiting for me. No driver. No husband. No child holding my hand. And for the first time in years, I felt light. That night, my phone exploded. Calls. Messages. Voicemails. I didn't answer a single one. Not when my ex called screaming that the bank had frozen accounts. Not when my son texted, "Mom, please, this isn't funny anymore." Not when his tone changed from anger to fear. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unfamiliar when you've lived your whole life reacting to other people's needs. And I cried. Not because I regretted what I did, but because I finally let myself grieve the family I thought I had. The next day, the calls turned desperate. My ex left voicemails that sounded nothing like the confident man I once married. "You need to fix this. Please talk to the bank. They're saying the accounts are over-leveraged. I don't understand how this happened." And then the one that almost made me laugh. "You always handled this stuff better than me." That's when it hit me. He still thought I'd save him. Still thought my role was to clean up his mess. Still thought love meant sacrifice without limits. And for the first time in my life, I said no. I blocked his number. I blocked my son's too. Not out of cruelty. Out of survival. Because sometimes love means stepping back and letting people experience the consequences of the choices they made while believing you'd always rescue them. A few days later, the messages shifted. From anger to panic. From panic to bargaining. From bargaining to silence. The silence was loud. And then, weeks later, the truth began leaking out. The business couldn't sustain itself without constant infusions of cash. The loans were coming due. Creditors were circling. Employees were being laid off. My ex's reputation, the one he built on confidence and charm, was cracking. People started asking questions. And when they did, the answers weren't pretty. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was scrambling, selling off assets, begging for extensions, making promises he couldn't keep. My son moved back into his childhood room, not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. That knowledge hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I never wanted to be right this way. One night, weeks later, there was a knock on my door. I didn't open it at first. I knew who it was. I could feel it. The weight, the hesitation, the regret. When I finally did open the door, He looked smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. My son stood there, eyes red, shoulders slumped. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know." I studied his face. The face I memorized the day he was born. The face I stayed up all night watching when he was sick. The face I used to kiss goodnight. And I realized something heartbreaking. He hadn't betrayed me because he was cruel. He betrayed me because he was afraid. Afraid of losing security. Afraid of losing status. Afraid of becoming ordinary. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at the table, not the old one, not the one full of memories, but a small, simple one in my new place. He cried. Really cried. And I listened, because that's what mothers do. But when he finished, when the silence returned, I said something he didn't expect. "I forgive you." He looked up sharply. "But that doesn't mean things go back to how they were." His face fell. "I can love you," I said, "without rescuing you." And that was the moment he understood. Love doesn't mean protection from consequences. It means allowing growth, even when it hurts. He left that night quieter than he arrived. And I didn't cry this time, because something in me had healed. Weeks passed, then months. The legal dust settled. My ex lost the business. The house went into foreclosure. The lifestyle he built on appearances collapsed. People stopped calling him, stopped inviting him, stopped believing his stories. And me? I built a life that finally felt like mine. Not extravagant, not flashy, but peaceful. I woke up without dread. I made decisions without fear. I slept without anxiety gnawing at my chest. And slowly, I started smiling again. Not the polite kind, the real kind. One afternoon, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the pain, the strength I didn't know I had. And I realized something that I want you to hear clearly. Sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who force us to become who we were always meant to be. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of something painful, something unfair, I want you to know this. You don't need revenge. You don't need to scream. You don't need to prove anything. You just need clarity and courage. Because once you stop protecting people who are hurting you, your life changes in ways you never imagined. And if you're still here with me, still listening, I want you to ask yourself one question. Who are you protecting that no longer deserves access to you? If this story spoke to you, if it made you feel seen, heard, or understood, tap that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story hit you the hardest. Because you're not alone. And you never were.